We are in the presence of a star here, and I'll tell you more about Professor Olivas in one moment, but I want to welcome you all. I'm Anastasia Mann Stacy. I direct the program on immigration and democracy here at Eagleton. Program has been in existence since 2007, and we're generally trying to advance the cause of research, public education, public service around the priorities that we feel are very pressing to do with immigration in this state and nationally. In the room are lots of advocates and researchers, really an A-list, and it's great that you're here and you've made a priority of this. I know how crazy schedules can be. I want to just point out that in the room we have Courtney McAnuff, who's the director of admissions here at Rutgers, and is somebody who's really made undocumented students, in his own way, a real priority through Rutgers Future Scholars, which is an important program that operates to help make opportunity for some of the many undocumented students in our midst, the most highly academically qualified ones. And maybe we'll get a chance to hear a little bit about that later, but great to have you here today. Thanks. And also John Alger, University General Counsel, also a star, civil rights star, comes to us from Michigan most recently, I think, right? Where he did a lot of the work on the affirmative action case that went to the Supreme Court. So that's a real boon to Rutgers to have John Alger with us. So thank you for being here. And now a couple of business items. We just have a schedule of our other talks in this series on that table. So if your interest is in immigration, you may want to check out Karthik Ramakrishnan, who's coming in 2 weeks, Katty Ko, Jamie Liu. These are all people who are doing really interesting work in the field, some related to education, in fact. And now, also please sign in if you haven't yet, so that we know who was here. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Michael Olivas, who is the William Bates Distinguished Chair of Law, holds the Distinguished Chair of Law, and is the director of the Institute of Higher Education and Law Governance at the University of Houston Law Center. He has numerous accolades, titles, too many really to name, but many of you have already read about him and know what they are. I wanted to just point out some of his book titles because they'll give you a sense of the wide array of interests that he has pursued, and they are The Dilemma of Access, Latino College Students. I'm not telling you all the presses and the years, but this will give you a sense. Colored Men and Hombres Aquí. And this is just a few of them. His 13th book, which is forthcoming, is called No Undocumented Child Left Behind. Oh wait, there's a 14th book. What's the title of the 14th book?
Sewing Alma Mater.
Sewing Alma Mater, there it
Soon
is.
To be available in fine bookstores everywhere.
Excellent. So basically, Michael Olivas is the man, if this is what you're interested in. It's a huge treat for us to have him here, really a thrill for the program, for Rutgers. He's gives talks in many places. He travels far and wide, but to have him here is really a thrill for us, and we all stand to learn a lot. So I will step aside now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It does take a village to get around these days and schlep. I do want to thank the driver who brought us here this morning from Philadelphia, who dodged all kinds of bad weather and so forth to get us here. And of course, even in a small group like this, I have many friends. I hired John Alger when I was general counsel of the AUP. Barbara Lee and I were classmates both in our doctoral program at Ohio State and in law school at Georgetown. Carlos Ortiz, a friend of mine, is general counsel of Goya. I need some adobo, by the way. I'm running a little low on adobo. And he's also a trustee at Montclair State. And then the estimable Mike Klein, who works for the even more estimable but retiring Darrell Greer, who actually will figure prominently in one of the examples we're giving today. So this, by the way, would have happened whether or not you'd been here. So I just want you to know.
I have to interject. I'm sorry, I forgot to announce.
Yeah.
The New Jersey Association of State Colleges and Universities is co-sponsoring this talk today. So
There you go.
Very exciting to have Darrell Greer, who's the founding CEO of that organization, and Michael Klein.
Do we got some cookies to go?
Yeah.
That's all we ask.
In fact, I knew Darrell's father, who was the superintendent of public instruction in the state of Ohio when I was there. What I'd like to do today is going to be very different than the conference that you had a couple weeks ago, where there were 800 people who showed up. I've never had maybe in total I've had 800 people, but I like to think that I'm among the elite opinion makers and movers and shakers, and perhaps even the defendants who might come out as a result of this. What I'd like to do is a couple of things. I'd like to review the successes and failures of Plyler versus Doe, the 1982 case that came out of Texas. That's really the high water mark of immigrants' rights. It didn't seem so at the time. I didn't realize I was practicing at the high water mark. I always had to adjust my own batting average to remember that simply slowing down the time of deportation is considered a victory when you practice this kind of law. I'm going to argue that Plyler's implementation has been largely successful, and that most state and federal attempts to overturn it have failed, not only because of the enduring legal opinion, but because of the backstory of these innocent sojourner children whose parents may have broken law, but they did not. And in our society, we do not hold sins of parents against children. Nonetheless, the efforts designed to remove undocumented children or undocumented parents are on the rise, in the hopes that when they leave, they will take their citizen children with them. And in fact, over 200,000 citizen children are removed and deported every year when their parents are, because until they're 18, their domicile is that of their parents, and so they can go back to Mexico or wherever they are, even though they're not of Mexico. In fact, most of these kids are more Americanized than your kids are, let me just tell you. There's also a significant number of Plyler children and even citizen children who are deported, especially as we ratchet up the anti-immigrant and nativist discourse that I'm going to talk about. Finally, I'm going to suggest that the real restrictionist goal is to eliminate birthright citizenship. That's the real game. These children are only pawns in this larger game. And there's an attempt to frame efforts any efforts at comprehensive immigration reform as undeserved and dangerous to the polity, and I want to speak in particular about that. But first I want to tell you about undocumented college students. I've been actively involved in residency reform and study since about 1975, when I was a doctoral student and a campus recruiter at the Ohio State University. As a Chicano student, I was drawn to recruit other Latinos to campus, but in Ohio at the time, the only communities with Mexican origin residents were located in the northern part of the state by Campbell, Ohio, Campbell Soups, where tomatoes and other perishable crops were being grown and processed. I discovered a number of these talented Mexican and Puerto Rican farm workers were interested in attending college, especially since the tomato and the pickle crops were being mechanized and the Latinos were not being hired in the canning factories at the time. However, each year, these students and their families would follow the crops, starting in Texas, where most of them were from, and then picking crops along the way until they would get up to Michigan. Or as we would say in Ohio, up to damned Michigan, where they would pick tree fruits and so forth and then return. But these travels meant that they couldn't establish residency in any state, even those at either end of the migrant stream where they maintained their legal domicile. In my typical graduate student way, I didn't know the complexity of the interstate residency systems, and so I asked why not. So I formed a ragtag group of advocates in Columbus, and we convinced the legislature and the Higher Education Coordinating Board to enact a change in Ohio law that enabled agricultural workers to accumulate the 12 months residency period over 3 consecutive years to break it up. Now, breaking it up this way seemed, in my amateur's way, a fair way to allow these farm workers a chance at college. To this day, I remember our big meeting with the Ohio Board of Regents officers, including the then young Darrell Greer. We even showed them the television movie Harvest of Shame, the classic Edward R. Murrow 1960 investigation into the plight of U.S. farm workers. Not Darrell, but the staff's biggest fear was that non-farm workers would pose as this new protected class of residents in order to avail themselves of this benefit. That someone not a migrant would try and pass for one had frankly never occurred to us, as not even Cesar Chavez had ever glamorized the profession enough to make it fashionable. I earnestly whipped out an application I brought in my files, a canvas bag like this, and I showed the administrators what a migrant academic transcript looked like. Grading periods for the same 7 high schools for the same 4 weeks over the same 4 years. Once they saw the transcripts, once the evidence and the discourse were in terms they could understand, their concerns were allayed, and we passed the legislation at the Ohio Board of Regents' suggestion. Moreover, once they were admitted, they were entitled to other grants and curricular benefits, and through a formal interstate compact for residency, they were entitled to residency in other contiguous states. And these students were U.S. citizens, not the undocumented field hands of today, lured by the back-breaking jobs that no one else wants to undertake. This was my first professional taste of how benefits and status are accorded by place and duration, and my first high-level political organizing success. Actually, it was my second. As an undergraduate in my college seminary, I convinced seminary officials to do away with Saturday morning classes, which had made me a hero with both classmates and faculty alike, let me say. But in the years since then, I've established residency as my subfield of study. I've conducted research, I've litigated cases, I've served on the campus residency appeals committees, I've been an expert witness in residency cases, and in one ironic twist, I was once sued for my university's denial of the residency benefit by one of my own law students, and defended by another former law student. And I also served in that case as both a hostile fact witness and an expert. So I know residency. I might add, his legal theory, for those of you who are lawyers, was that he was a true, honest-to-God, real Texan. That's the 11th Amendment, I think, to the Constitution, and he did not prevail, let me say. So I know residency, but others do not, or they misperceive it. These undocumented students who I'm going to discuss have met all the admissions criteria. They've met all the traditional residence requirements, and they displace no one on academic grounds. And you, of course, know this in your capacity as admissions officer. Except for the different fee bills that they receive, they're indistinguishable from other college students, except that they're usually tremendous achievers. As I was telling people at lunch, 16 of the salutatorians and valedictorians in the Houston Public Schools 2 years ago were undocumented. These were striver children, children that we all want to enroll and who will someday be our members of our community. Even in California, where 40% of all the undocumented residents are assumed to live, undocumented college students constitute an almost invisible minority of students. Colleges in the U.S. have accustomed themselves to these students' presence, have administered their enrollments without incident, even though federal financial aid funds are unavailable to this population, as are most state funds. No studies ever shown there to be a substantial number, even in border area colleges. In fact, I was once asked by the New York Times reporter how many there were. I said, in my view, between 50 and 60,000. And that, of course, if you Google that, that's actually the source of a lot of these numbers. I won't say that I pulled it out of my coat pocket, but I did thoroughly look at this. And, of course, 50 to 60,000 students is the Ohio State campus. That's one campus. These are not students who are overrunning the border. In fact, through expert testimony and research, it's very evident that the lure of college is not a pull factor to attract illegal immigration. These students, in fact, have to be here for 3 years, whereas most New Jerseyans simply have to be here for 12 months. Nonetheless, listen to the kind of rhetoric that the restrictionists play in this, including the Martinez case, a case that the restrictionists brought to strike down the California statute. Even though the statute, by the way, 80% of that California statute was being used by white residents of California who had abandoned their domicile there to go to school elsewhere and wanted to come back to grandfather themselves in by these provisions in order to attend post-baccalaureate schools, such as law schools and so forth. So 80% of them weren't even undocumented. They'd simply abandoned residence and were coming back to reclaim it. Here's what Ralph Casarda, one of the lawyers in the Martinez case, said. Please come on in. There's plenty of space over here. In outright defiance of federal laws, politicians from states that do offer in-state tuition to illegal aliens argue with a straight face that granting eligibility for in-state tuition is not a post-secondary education benefit. Since Plyler does not require states to provide a college education to adult legal aliens, state taxpayers should mercifully be spared this unnecessary expense. But driven by political ideology rather than concern for their state's fiscal well-being, some state politicians have enacted legislation that forces their constituents to subsidize the post-secondary education of adult illegal aliens. Well, that well-known undocumented college student lobby, of course, has led to that well-known undocumented college student lobby. Others, such as Chris Kobach, my bête noire, has argued that states and legislators offering admission and resident tuition are engaged in nullification, in defiance, and in law-breaking. He calls the DREAM Act the nightmare of the DREAM Act. But these objections to undocumented alienage and the enrollments are not rooted in careful research and analytic study. My reading of the discourse leads me to believe that those who object do not do so on meritocratic or substantive grounds. For example, one November, I get a call from someone saying, Michael, quick, turn on the Republican debate, which, oddly enough, I hadn't been following. And there they were discussing the efficacy of undocumented tuition. Mike Huckabee, for whom I will always be grateful, says we do not, in our society, punish children for the sins of their parents. Governor Mitt Romney's objections that the money being used to serve the undocumented deprives lawfully resident aliens of their benefits. Well, this rings hollow even as presidential politics. I might add that I also love Mike Huckabee because he said he would forgive Keith Richards for a failure to appear in court and would nullify that traffic ticket of years ago. I think anybody that would do that, if you're going to vote, if you're inclined that way, that alone would earn my vote. Now, he is a Republican, so I don't expect to be voting for him, but if I were so disposed, he would have my vote, or Governor Christ, who, as you may know, recently pardoned James Morrison, having determined that after 40 years, the felony for which he had been convicted, and then he died 6 months later, was no longer appropriate, and so he, in his last act of office, spared him as well. Turns out, Republicans encouraging lawbreakers. You heard it here first. Now, some legislation has even been so mean-spirited as to advocate a repealing of Plyler versus Doe and the constitutional provisions that enable the native-born children to be U.S. citizens. As I said earlier, this is the real game that's up, is trying to remove parents and even citizen children in the hopes that we will not continue to interpret the 14th Amendment as conferring birthright citizenship. Now, all of these arguments that are mixed in this cauldron amidst the shrill warnings about the rights of real Americans lead inevitably to a sense of divisiveness, of racial superiority, and undifferentiated prejudice. In fact, hundreds of anti-alien bills have been introduced and enacted, as if these workers were the source of the sputtering economy, instead of, frankly, the savior of that economy. Even when virtually every government study has shown that immigrants, however defined, are net economic contributors and will be so even more after their incorporation through comprehensive immigration reform when it does come, especially since they're ineligible for most of the benefits at the back end. Most that is made of the detrimental effects of immigration rings hollow. Criminals are not deterred from entering or remaining in the country, that they remain stubbornly monolingual in languages other than English. They take jobs and services from citizens. They undercut and depress wages. They do not understand the American character, and that their unlawful presence is itself a sign of an unwillingness to abide by rules or accept responsibility. Of course, these traits, to the extent that they're accurate, do describe some immigrants in legal status or in undocumented status, just as surely as they describe some natives. But let's look at these in just a brief detail. Remaining stubbornly monolingual in languages other than English. The big problem isn't that these ethnic enclaves, linguistic enclaves occur. The terms of Quebec are often invoked in this regard. The big problem is that most of these kids grow up not learning Spanish. The language loss is so evident in any immigrant studies that by the time they are second generation, that is, by the time that their parents were born in the United States, they have almost always had the ethnicity and the linguistic extirpated from their character, and in fact, through intermarriage and other means, have assimilated into the U.S. society in ways that render them virtually Americanized. In fact, if there were a group that holds promise to become productive long-term residents and citizens, alien college students would certainly be that group. With the generally dismal schooling available to them, that even a small percentage could meet the standards of Rutgers and the University of California and other major institutions is extraordinary. Given their status and struggle, and that they're ineligible for virtually all assistance and cannot work legally, it's been my experience that each represents a success story of substantial accomplishment. Now, while I don't wish to seem or to be reductionist, certainly don't want to seem that way, or to generalize beyond recognition, it's been my experience that most of these students are high-achieving strivers with a resilience and a persistence held by very few native citizens who are born to advantage relative to these students, and most have parents who struggle to bring them to this country and exercise considerable risk to enable them to achieve. This, of course, is the lesson of Plyler versus Doe. That these students do achieve under extraordinary circumstances is remarkable to virtually all who observe them, and it partially explains why so many educators and legislators have accepted Plyler and have worked to assist these students, these Plyler students, these DREAM Act students, in navigating the complexities of schools and college. Despite the successes of anti-immigrant rhetoric in shaping a discourse and in fashioning resentments, reasonable legislators of both parties have actually seen through the fog and in many instances have attempted to address these issues, notwithstanding the political blowback. When Senator Hatch, Republican of Utah, introduces the DREAM Act, I thought 10 years ago that all the ground cover was necessary. He introduced it with the late Senator Kennedy, who we miss more than ever. And for many years it sat there, but it kept being introduced and had an effect at the state level. This underlying support to remedy the failures of national immigration reform are much better barometers of the country's acceptance of this shadow population and generosity than the bleedings of the Lou Dobbs of the world. The evidence shows how tenuous the Plyler decision was in the first place, with a substantial dose of luck and persistence, but especially the powerful backstory of innocent children. Scholars who look carefully and thoroughly at the case have determined that it is sui generis, not so much limited to its facts as to possessing little constitutional significance, in large part because no cases before the court have come on all fours since that time. That is, it remains good law, and by most indications is so. However, Plyler versus Doe only protected students from state legislation. There's always the chance that federal legislation could have been enacted that would render these children ineligible. And the one attempt with Representative Gallegly in the 1990s was battened down even two Republican senators, such as Senator Phil Graham, voted against it, or said he would vote against it. And it entered into, as an exchange, much of the exchange between President Clinton and the newly Republican House and Senate in 1994 when that revolution took place. The political events since 1982, that is the year the case was decided, have not led to serious challenges on legislative fronts, even though Plyler has always been vulnerable to this federal one. With the one exception of a successful challenge to the California ballot initiative, which struck down all of these provisions, no serious state actions have threatened their educational access in the 30-plus years since those cases. Notwithstanding, there have been many permutations that have arisen in the lower federal and state courts, and it's the case that immigrant advocates have had to shore up and relitigate a number of the corollary and subsidiary issues flowing from the touchstone Plyler case. But on the whole, they've been beaten back most of the secondary direct and diagonal threats, such as many of the policies that affect immigrant youth. Just as an example, there are a number of school districts that require driver's licenses to identify parents who would pick up their children. Well, in most states, all but 6, the undocumented are ineligible for driver's licenses. Another foolish policy, by the way, that leads to unlicensed drivers and, even worse, uninsured drivers on our roads. Others include the jiggering of attendance zones so as to try and rule some of these kids out, or other such threats, the requiring of Social Security numbers by school districts as a regular policy, even though they're not allowed. If you pull out your Social Security card, if any of you still have one, it says it's not to be used for identification purposes. In fact, its only legal use is if you wish to deduct someone on your Social Security, on your income tax. Now, while the number of these students have been small, it's not been inconsiderable, and federal law addressing the college achievement came very close to enactment 3 times, ones that I'll mention in a moment. Again, suggesting the widespread public acceptance of these children in the polity, even past the point when they were innocent children brought here surreptitiously by their parents. I've debated any number of nativists and restrictionists over the years, and the one piece that's harder to respond to, though clearly not impossible, is, well, okay, we'll grant that the children have to be here because their parents are here, although that is in and of itself problematic. But once they turn 18, why don't they just go back to Mexico or to wherever else they are? Well, let me just say that betrays an ignorance about immigration and the direction in which that would flow. And of course, the fact is that we have so thoroughly militarized the border and been so good on enforcement. Who knew the Democrats were going to be so good on enforcement? That we have a record number of the undocumented because the circular migration patterns have been broken, because once people are here, they stay here. There's no better work or opportunities in Mexico or wherever they came from. And coming back is such a dangerous and expensive option that they simply stay here. Moreover, these children going back to these countries, as shows when if they're citizen children who are repatriated with their parents, who are undocumented and who are caught up in the various sweeps, shows that they don't really grow up there. They don't, believe me, notwithstanding the suggestions that they're stubbornly monolingual in a language other than English, they don't speak Spanish. If they do, they don't speak it well. Just enough perhaps to discuss things with their abuelito and their abuelita, their grandparents. Now, eventually, when comprehensive immigration is enacted, these Plyler legacies will be the first in line to take advantage of the transformative powers of citizenship. They will be educated, they will speak English, they will, in all likelihood, not have committed crimes. They will simply be incorporated, and that will happen. Even as states have ratcheted up the efforts to apprehend undocumented parents and unauthorized workers, safe havens for the college children have been carved out and maintained, not universally, but widely. As you might expect, although it's not clear to me living in Texas why you would expect it there, but many people do, Texas was the first state to enact in-state tuition residence. In fact, the governor who signed it became governor because Governor Bush became President Bush. Since that time, 11 states have signed it, although Oklahoma has rescinded it. And if you were to add, in particular, New Jersey and Florida, you would have all the major states save Arizona, because Arizona right now has just gone so crazy. After all, they're looking for all these headless immigrant bodies in the desert that their governor, these headless immigrant bodies in the desert. You guys, obviously, word of that hasn't gotten up here. You didn't know that there were headless immigrant bodies in the desert in Arizona, according to Governor Brewer. But as just one example, Utah, not thought of as a particularly hospitable climate to immigrants, because after all, they have no history in that state of people having moved there to escape persecution. But even Utah, which moved to enact significant restrictionist employment and benefit legislation, retained its earlier post-secondary resident status for undocumented college students. They carved out this little niche for these students, and so they continue to enroll. Who would have thought Utah? Who would have thought Kansas? Who would have thought Nebraska? Who would have thought Oklahoma? While several states have enacted harsh measures, such as South Carolina banning the students from enrolling, and others such as Virginia, Missouri, and Arizona, who have not accorded them in-state residence even while having a chance, or for that matter, this state, which had its chance recently and let it die, most of the major receiver states have extended them this status. These are surely markers of how deeply the roots of Plyler have reached into our country's soil. And the truth is that the United States needs this talent pool. In many highly technical fields, foreign scholars enroll in high numbers, and after consuming the benefit, return to their countries. This is as it should be, as learning respects no borders. And U.S. institutions are surely enriched by recruiting internationally. However, the undocumented have every incentive to remain here, to adjust their status, and to contribute to the U.S. economy. My own experiences with these students over the year is that they are extremely loyal to the United States. Despite their undocumented status, most are more Americanized than native-born students, and they believe in the immigrant success story, having lived it in most instances. In fact, many of these students do not know that they're undocumented. Their first encounter is when they go to get a driver's license, or, depending on the state, or when they apply to college and have to show up and prove up documentation. In my native New Mexico each year, Santa Feans ritualistically burn Sosobra, Old Man Gloom, a 40-foot straw figure to expiate the year's accumulation of grief and indignities. Fiesta goers aren't aware of the culture's sociological significance, and they'd be astounded to find themselves the subject of an anthropologist's probing of their community norms and mores. The inner logic of their acts of expiation isn't questioned or even manifest. They do it each year because the community did it the year before at Fiesta. After examining all the arguments raised by restrictionists on the issues of undocumented college residents, I've come to believe that those who raise objections, particularly those who act upon these beliefs, do so to burn Sosobra, and thus to expiate their own fear and loathing of the unknown. Just as 19th century California prison officials banned pigtails on prisoners and oppressed them through a series of measures to keep Chinese immigrants in their place. These storytellers have resorted to false stories and scapegoating in their campaign to vilify immigrants. If you turn to certain television stations, you can't watch a story without the impact of illegal alienage, of the term which I banished from my head, anchor babies. These children who are so clever that they arrange to be born in the United States so they will have citizenship, so that 21 years later, when they're first eligible to bring parents here, they might bring their parents. Children that smart ought to be allowed in the United States. When I consider the hydraulics of immigration, about which I've thought for a long time, and the likely downsides of the nativists' actions. And when I count the rise of immigrant-related proposals at the state and local level, I'm convinced that no good can come from this sub-federal assumption of immigration powers. Some of the inefficiencies in the current system are incontestably dysfunctional, but some would be the result of increased overlap in immigration enforcement. More importantly, these changes would not appreciably improve the current system, which already has coordinating provisions built in, if not widely adopted. For example, virtually every major police force has said, we do not want to undertake immigrant enforcement. We have enough problem with enforcing crimes, and this would make it impossible for us to interact with immigrant communities because they would not only view us as the police, bad enough, especially depending on what country you come from, but they would not trust us and would not report crimes. And so the entire population would be less safe and more at risk were they to adopt these kind of sub-local ordinances that turn renters into terrorists and which turn landlords into investigators. All you have to do is to look at the laws that were attempted to be passed in Hazleton or Farmers Branch, Texas, both of which were struck down on preemption grounds, to check the immigration status of renters and of license holders. All of these are a sure sign of a racial, ethnic, and national origin tax that would only be levied upon certain groups, certain to be Mexicans in particular, or equally likely Mexican Americans. These more than petty nuisances are reminiscent of our inglorious immigration history, particularly that of racial exclusion, and they're pigtail ordinances in modern guise. Despite their surface attractiveness and thin veneer, they should be resisted as fixes. Now, let me just give two examples. Carl Hayden High School in Phoenix has a National Robotics Champion team with 4 undocumented students who won a national award. And so, as a reward, as a prize, they get to go to Buffalo. Now, I know you're thinking, that's not much of a prize, okay? With all of you who drove in from Buffalo this morning, no offense. They can't see real well, so they say, let's go to the Canadian side. So the kids cross and they go over, and then they try and come back. And they're all admitted, except the 4 who look Mexican. Walking while Mexican. These kids, of course, don't carry passports. They're kids. They're in Buffalo. They're crossing the border. Turns out all 4 of them are documented. Eventually, they all won private relief and were admitted. My only question is, why would a public high school in Phoenix only have 4 Mexicans in it? That, to me, is the real $1,000 question. Contrast this with the white lawyer from Atlanta who has tuberculosis, goes to Europe to get married. They find out he's infectious and they call him back in. So he sneaks into Canada under an assumed name, and in order to cross the border, where his name is on a watch list, he presents his credentials to a Border Patrol agent who says, well, you look fine to me, but your name is on this list, but come on in. A week later, just to prove there is a God, he loses a lung to tuberculosis. Proving that there's a God. God, this is a tough audience. When Corzine was in office, they would have laughed at that joke, okay? We'll just say your sense of humor has declined along with other things. Now, my belief is this guy should have had a low jack on his butt. He was going to hurt people. He was coughing all over people. He flew on international flights where everybody's like this. He comes across in his own name, he's on a watch list, and he's admitted. At least he had the smarts not to look Mexican. And, of course, he was stubbornly monolingual in a language of English. Now, on occasion, the centrist view can prevail, as it did in Plyler. When the case was wending its way through the courts, encountering the fortuitous events and forces that occurred on its way to the Supreme Court, the recent history of San Antonio versus Rodriguez was in evidence. The school law case that found that education was not a fundamental right. Now that case again, Rodriguez, including Latinos, though not brought by Latino lawyers, 12 years later results in this 5-4 decision. Less than 12 years later. Less than a decade later results. How did we travel so far from Rodriguez, which holds that even conceitedly poorly funded and inequitably funded school districts that largely privileged the wealthy, how could we travel from there to allowing the undocumented to remain in schools? Well, in large part, Justice Powell had lived the life and had said in a footnote that if there were an occasion where students were absolutely precluded from receiving an education, then there might be an action. Well, simply getting less of a good education isn't the same as being precluded from education, though one might question that. But years later, in 1977, when these children were being charged and their parents $1,000 in order to attend public institutions that were free by law, and where, by the way, truancy statute still required these children to be enrolled in school or their parents subject to law and to punishment, we had, in effect, as he found it, a complete preclusion from education. And so he overruled, even with the scrutiny available, the arguments of the state that this was simply an attempt to regulate immigration. Now, he didn't decide this on preemption grounds, as he might have. He decided on equal protection grounds. Now, when you look at the history then and now, the big single difference is that there was not the anti-immigrant rhetoric so ratcheted up then as now. Now, it's true that there have always been restrictionist groups, but it was unimaginable that there could be a breach by a congressman heckling the president of the United States about immigrant health care in a televised congressional session. You lie, you recall, was his response to President Obama's suggestion that the undocumented would be ineligible for health care, as they are. You lie would have been completely unfathomable in 1982. Paradoxically, Plyler's widespread acceptance, even in a time of increased authorized and unauthorized immigration, has occurred in this context of unprecedented nativism. As well, the face of unmatched concerns about national security and terrorism, including serious suggestions from presidential candidates that Pakistanis who hate us are hiding in Mexico and coming across because they look so much like Mexicans. It may have been true that he was going to pardon Keith Richards, but he doesn't know a thing about Mexicans and Pakistanis, and there's never been any indication that a terrorist has come up from Mexico. Now, on the other hand, we do have white lawyers with lung disease and tuberculosis coming in and identifying themselves and crossing without their LoJacks from the north. Because of this rhetoric, which I'm going to speak about in a moment, much of today's attention has been paid to rooting out the core reason for undocumented workers who come to our factories. That they have children, including U.S. citizen children, is less the dominant focus than is the original sin of the parents following the siren call of work, and then having children who become citizens. As the stories that I've shown here have revealed, Plyler was always a close call. The decision was surprising in as much as it followed the hapless experience of Rodriguez, but it's widely understood to be one of a kind, perhaps the high moral ground, iconic but limited in its application. But it did transform immigration law in both broad and narrow fashion. I don't want to bore you with all of the residency cases that follow from here. But I'm persuaded that in the collective brainstem of most Mexican Americans, we need to hear no more than the mention of Operation Wetback, the Bracero program, the Secure Border Initiative, to flinch at increased federal authority or congressional delegation of power to the executive branch. Now, notwithstanding that, we cannot have 50 local and state immigration policies any more than we can have 50 foreign policies. And this can cut either way. My governor in New Mexico declared the state a sanctuary state. He said, of course, he found the courage of his conviction on the last week of his one term, as a lot of these guys find their courage on the way out the door. But as a result, someone brought an undocumented worker in and said, I rely upon Governor Anayas having said so. That, of course, has to be struck down. In the book, under detrimental reliance, pendejo, stupid, there it is, that case. On the other hand, you cannot have Farmers Branch or Hazleton, Pennsylvania enacting legislation that they said wasn't trying to take and usurp federal authority, notwithstanding the fact it was called the Hazleton Immigrant Reform Act. Someone should have told the drafters. I'm persuaded that these loosely woven threads of unfettered discretion and distrust of the process can be stitched solely by a robust sense and application of the preemption doctrine. Lack of efficacy and failure to perform the job well has never been given constitutional rise to states or locales undertaking provisions and actions that were designed exclusively to the federal branch. Even though I share the distrust, I'm more loath to allow it to cascade down to the state and local levels where I can't run into court with every farmer's branch. I can go to Congress and say you can't remove birthright citizenship. Do it once. It applies to everybody. However, we have gotten to the point now where virtually every state has introduced some kind of law and enacted some of them, mostly anti-immigrant. And the communitarian seeds of Plyler may not have rooted in the sterile nativistic soil, but a morally appealing result is surely preferable to this. And it may be difficult for immigrant activists and defenders to remain vigilant when the threats do occur, either at the state level or the federal level, but I prefer to cast my lot with the more generous impulses of traits in the American character, trusting and verifying the challenges and recognizing the long view. However, in today's restrictionist soil, we have white teenagers in Long Island undertaking a Saturday night event of going beaner hunting. Just so you know, beaner hunting means looking for Mexicans. Beaners, long identified as Mexicans, and so they go out and they kill poor Marcos Lucero, who, as it turns out, is a permanent resident here legally and from Ecuador, not to be confused with Mexico. And then they said, well, we didn't know he was Ecuadorian. Well, this is the problem with hate speech derived from these anti-immigrant narratives where anybody who doesn't look like they do in New York are held to be threats and outsiders and others who may be harmed as a result. In my own home state of New Mexico, where 45% of us are Mexican, New Mexico, just for those who weren't listening there, 3 students who looked Latino standing outside Del Norte High School. Again, stubbornly monolingual that we are, we name our high schools of the North, Del Norte. And they were arrested and informed of their rights, don't speak. But one of them does, and the arresting officer, himself Mexican-American, says, I detected a hint of a Spanish accent. 3/4 of New Mexico, including Anglos, speak with Mexican accents. That's my family. They removed the 3 of them, even though they were not breaking any law. They were on school grounds, normally a sanctuary of sorts. They weren't violating law, and they were removed. And of course, the state argued, the city argued, with its Mexican-American lawyer mayor, my classmate Marty Chavez from Georgetown, said, well, turned out we were right. We got these 3, they were undocumented. Well, Yeah, if you round up enough people who are standing while looking Mexican, you're going to find some, especially in a state where we're half the population. What do the arithmetic on this? You cast a net in New Mexico, especially northern New Mexico, you're going to find a Mexican. My people came from Mexico, what was not even yet Mexico, in 1695. Yeah, he's going to find me if I'm there. He's going to catch me. Now, these narratives, in my view, have tremendous consequences because not only do we get to demonize them, but our media capture their essence. Anchor babies, illegal aliens, or even worse, illegals. I've been on a one-person effort to try and get the New York Times to change its style manual, which calls the use of undocumented immigrants to be euphemistic, and then they use illegal. And so everybody else who follows lemming-like this style manual, as most of them do, call them illegal immigrants, when of course people can't be illegal, only their actions. And that's to be determined by law and not by thugs in the street who are mistaking Mexicans for Ecuadorians. The prosecutor never asked, what would you have done if you really were Mexican? I mean, would that have somehow lessened it? Their defense, by the way, was, number one, we didn't do it. Number two, we didn't know he was Ecuadorian. And we didn't know he was here legally. Well, these all have consequences. And I'd be pleased to answer questions you might have, but I do want to end on one piece of advice for those of you who have direct contact with immigrant students. Do not despair. This is going to resolve itself. You should stay in school right now and don't do anything to come to the attention of authorities. Do not disclose or out yourself. This has serious detrimental consequences. I understand that all of you want to be Martin Luther King writing letters from Birmingham jail. You're not. He was a highly educated person, and once if he lived through his incarceration, something that wasn't always clear, he would return to the game. If you are arrested or out yourself, you may be safe, or you may think you're safe, although I would argue you're not. But your parents will be found, your employers will be found, and your school officials will be found. When a woman at Kennesaw State University in Georgia was captured for a traffic violation, and let me just tell you, this morning I saw 50 of these things on Route 1. People crossing over, driving too fast, driving while Mexican. Let me tell you, the safest thing you could be is be hit by an undocumented immigrant, because they're driving too slow. They're driving, which of course gives rise in many states to profiling, because if you're driving slow, you're probably doing something wrong. When they went back and they discovered 600 undocumented students in the entire state of Georgia, they removed them all and said you can no longer enroll. This has consequences. She wasn't even outing herself. So be as law-abiding as you're able to be. Do not despair. Do not disclose. Do not out yourself. I realize that there are people, including many otherwise responsible people, they will not be able to help you one whit if you out yourself. Let me just tell you, you will find yourself in the police station, the immigration authority, and then back in Mexico as the pocho that they will treat you. So I come to you with a heart filled with optimism. I am confident that comprehensive immigration reform will occur in my lifetime. I believe, because I have to believe this, at some point the adults will get together, the insurers will get together, the lamb and the lion will lie down. So stay in school until that time. I also identify very troubling trends, ones that, in my view, largely single out Mexicans. We aren't concerned about Swedes coming here, undocumented Swede, Norwegians with their lutefisk. The only reason I don't believe in open borders is because they'll bring in ABBA from Sweden. And what are they doing in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Just when Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens isn't in the Hall of Fame. There are injustices to rail against, and I'd be glad to answer questions about that and any other such, desgraciadamente, should you have questions. Thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Given the demographics that have been released over the past few months, do you think the Republican Party is making quite a misjudgment in attacking Mexican citizens or Latino citizens when in a few years the demographics in many states will take over?
Well, you know, I wish I had a better insight into Republican politics. They haven't consulted me. In my home state of New Mexico, we just elected a Mexican-American governor. She's a Republican. First thing she did was try and get rid of the driver's license law. Simply having the numbers doesn't mean, and even elected Mexican-Americans doesn't mean that it's going to go in the right direction, in my view. So I always treat them like Reagan said with Russians. You know, you trust what you verify. And this was her first act, by the way. It got shut down last night. Again, proof that there's a God if you still needed it after Abba being elected. At least two of them are dead, and so they can't travel anymore as Abba. That's another good thing. Abba.
No, I just.
Oh, Ab? Well, no, it's more Ba. It's more likely to be Ba. Yeah, I think the A and the B died, so what's left is the B and the A. Yeah, Abba actually stood for something, you know, sort of like bad music. Well, I know it's a serious question, deserves a more serious response. I don't know what it means, though, in as much as even in states, I mean, by that logic, New Mexico and California would be faring better by immigrants. And of course, that's, in Texas, for that matter. Texas, of course, is where Plyler came about. Although, I will tell you that Governor Perry, to his credit, first of all, he has the greatest hair in the world. You know, great hair. I sat behind him at a funeral and I looked at it. It was actually real too. You know, I expected it sort of to move as he did, but it appears to be real. But he has said, I will not. He signed into law the statute allowing these students to gain in-state tuition. Since that time, they can get Texas grants. We have a TAFSPA, a special form for Texas undocumented students. And he has said, don't bring me any law that would overturn this. I believe it's a good thing. Now, maybe he's doing the math and he believes that some of these kids will eventually be thankful and become Republicans. Almost all the incorporation literature that Anastasia and others will be reading and producing will show they're more likely to become Democrats, in fact. But some of them will. The governor of New Mexico, the governor of Nevada, the new senator in Florida are all Republicans. You know, except for your own Menendez, there's no senator who's a Latino Republican. I mean, he's a Democrat, but they don't all turn out that way. So it's never been clear to me that one meant the other. And of course, their kids could become more conservative, or their parents more conservative, or thankful. I always thought that a lot of people would thank the Republicans because Senator Hatch introduced this. And then he took a walk at the last minute. He decided he couldn't support it because they didn't want Obama to have a win. And so even he who introduced this 12 years, and who took a hit for it, he actually had an opponent in a primary last time, and this time. I didn't realize there was a right to Orrin Hatch. I mean, that's a very small patch of ground, let me just say. He had one. Of course, he beat him 70-30, so they arrested the guy for impersonating a candidate. I mean, down the road, he wasn't going to win, but it meant these don't cut in the direction most people think. And so I have found many Republicans, in fact, who have privately said, I want to support this, but we just can't let this happen right now. I mean, their big choice, and they're banking everything on trying to get rid of President Obama, and they can't give him this because it will be a victory. But it would have taken, under that DREAM Act, it would have taken between 12 and 16 years for these kids to become citizens. If that had passed, and states like New Jersey would still have to enact in-state tuition. So the DREAM Act is not a panacea. It's not the silver bullet, and it's not going to resolve some of these intractable issues that still are state-run issues. And so I don't know I know the political science answer to that. I'm just not sure how it's really going to work in real life. Yes. If you don't mind, I'm going to take this off. Yeah.
I don't mind.
Go ahead. No.
So in New Jersey, a couple of years ago, the ACLU looked at public schools in New Jersey and how They were handling the registration of students who came to the schools and discovered that well over half of the districts were asking for inappropriate documentation. And we've been doing some follow-up on this, and one of our concerns is that we need to get a case so that we can move this along. And the concern is that to make a case, someone has to come forward and say, I was the student, or my parents were the student. And in that instance, then, if either the child or the parents are undocumented, now their name is on the record and they will be deported. So,
or they're doe. Remember, these kids, that was the case in Texas as well, and they got styled anonymously.
So the concern seems to be whether it can be styled anonymously.
Well, I think that's a second order question. I think it would be a terrible mistake to litigate that. I mean, my own view would be, that I serve on the MALDEF board, and we haven't taken that case because the dynamics and there's only Woody Hayes, the football coach at Ohio State, said if you run, there's only one bad thing that can happen: you drop the ball. If you pass, you can drop the ball, you can have it intercepted. There's several bad things. Well, here the bad things are that you can go to court and lose, and then and it depends on the court, it depends on the circumstances, but whether or not the children have been harmed. No, I would say that there's plenty of advocacy available to shoot those things down. I get them struck down almost on a routine basis. I've got language that I use that I routinely send to schools or have MALDEF do so. I'm sure the Pearl Deaf Latino organization in New York has stuff. In fact, I'm going to a fundraiser next week. Carlos Ortiz is their former board chair. No, there are many things shy of lawsuits in order to get them to comply. In fact, some states, like Virginia, a state you wouldn't expect it, actually have it in their code now that you can't ask for this kind of stuff. So I mean, there are many administrative remedies shy of going to court, and so I would say I would tackle someone trying to get into court in that case.
So we have been successful in getting and Stacy was actually the lead person on this, helping to get the then acting Commissioner of Education to send a notice out to principals and superintendents reminding them of the Plyler. And our concern now is policy diffusion.
To be sure, but as long as the heads up are doing that, there's going to be a file somewhere, and the lawyers, every school district's got a lawyer. My students at work, a good thing. And I think that you might work through state superintendents, organizations, school boards, and so forth. They don't want frivolous cases. I mean, there are many ways shy of going to court, but boy, the last resort has to be going to court. Believe me, MALDEF always tries to resolve these things, as does Pearl Deaf. It's just too expensive. Right now, we had to close our Atlanta office to bring all the suits we're bringing in Arizona right now.
Wow.
Despite all the growth in the Southeast, we're going to win the Arizona case. We're going to win it. But it's going to take us 2 years to do so. We had to move 3 lawyers out there. We didn't have an office there. So they're all in Motel 6s or the equivalent. We're going to win. They're going to owe us money. It's going to take 2 years to get that money afterwards. This is like wildcatting, and you don't hit the oil. But we're going to hit the oil, and we're going to win, but it's going to kill us in the meantime. I indicate we're changing the name from the Mexican-American Legal Offense Fund to the Dutch Legal Offense Fund because we're running out of digits to plug up all the holes. And this is very important expertise that we have. And that, of course, we also do voting rights. We also do school finance, all the other kinds of things. Believe me, we don't go to court unless we absolutely have to, unless all negotiations have failed. So I think that the other instincts were the proper instincts.
Thank you.
Additional questions over here? Have you answered all your questions? God, this is such a great group. Yes.
It seems like in the past, since the failure of DREAM Act, there have been so many states.
The failure of Congress to enact
DREAM Act, and the triumph of students. There have been so many different states that have taken up either pro in-state tuition laws or anti-in-state tuition laws, or trying to repeal laws that they already have. And that's been really exciting. But I guess how do you see, what are good arguments to make about states that are concerned about their budgets, that education being one of the top costs in their budget, and states that don't want to take up in-state tuition laws because, you know, they say this is, you know, not now, this isn't something that we can handle in our budget?
Well, my first question is, if not now, when? It's only getting more expensive. These students are no more expensive than others. You know, they've got to be there for 3 years. They've been paying tuition, or excuse me, taxes, like everybody else. In fact, depending on the state, like in Texas, where there's no state income tax, if you can believe it, they pay disproportionately because of all the transaction taxes and property taxes. So the economic argument doesn't really cut it. These students are completely indistinguishable in class from anybody else, and they're going to be with us at some point, so they're our children, and we need to educate them. That's like saying it would simply be, it would cost less if we just said, Rutgers, you can't have 40,000 students, you only have 20,000. Well, of course they'd save some money. And what are the other 20,000 going to do? They're going to leave the state and go somewhere else. After all, New Jersey, as you know, is the biggest exporter of its high school graduates to other states to go to college, so you already can't staunch that flow. So that's a false economy. As to what other states should do, well, as I said, even if they pass the DREAM Act tomorrow, you're still going to have a state DREAM Act in order to have in-state tuition. So they intersect with each other, but they're really completely different transactions. And so I would say keep acting on those activities and keep pushing on those. And what is going to be more expensive? Having this kid hang around, lurking in the shadows, probably being attracted by alternatives because regular society has rejected him or her. They can't go back. I mean, these kids are smart kids. They're going to manifest their talents in ways that are either going to help us walk in the straight and narrow, or they're going to find other alternatives. And I don't even want to know what those alternatives are. They're less likely to put tax money in the coffers than educating these kids. I can't even contemplate an argument to be made on economic grounds, because until you're about 30, you're all a net drain on the state. I don't care where you live. If you live in Princeton, or if you live in Montclair, or wherever you live, you aren't paying any taxes. You're just mostly consuming. And we're all mamonas at that point, and then we grow up, and at some point we start contributing. And what you want to do is to educate them, because they're more likely to stay there and become citizens in your state if they take their degree here. So that, to me, that's the logic I would use, and that's more of a political economy argument. But I would certainly not make the argument that you can't do it because of cost. You can't afford not to do it, truth be told. And they don't cost more. And by the way, because they don't get federal funds, and because you can't give them assistance from New Jersey, they're going to have to make it on their own. So if they do make it, they're going to make it with their own resources, for the most part, paying tuition that's higher than it used to be. And they're not going to be a net drain on the economy. In fact, all the studies I've ever seen show that they're a net plus to the economy. Additional questions people might have? God, this is such a smart audience. Yes. You get a second choice, yeah? They can ask questions.
So the other interesting situation that we have is we are aware of a case of a U.S. citizen child being denied financial aid on the basis that the parents are not legal residents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we won that case in California. I mean, I think you ought to talk to parole deaf lawyers. I mean, that their eligibility for aid is, especially if they're 18, they're adults, they're citizen adults, they're eligible for it. The only question is, how do you go about getting information from the undocumented parents? And they're in time. They're required. The parents are required by law to file income taxes. They usually use an ITIN, international tax number, identification number. I didn't want to be technical. So the question, but the parents will have to prove up how much income they had, and depending on the work that they have, they may or may not be able to do that. But I would assume that these kids, especially citizen children who have undocumented parents, by need basis are certainly entitled. And I would love to take the case of someone who's a citizen child being denied this. We went to California, they folded almost immediately, and I'd be glad if you contacted me to send you the details on that particular case. Citizen children can't be punished for having undocumented parents once they're 18. They can be repatriated, as I said, by that, because domicile is that of the parents. But once they're 18, you have to come back. anchor babies that they are, just waiting to sign up mom. Right.
Great.
Additional questions people might have.
Michael,
Yes.
I can't shut up.
I'm just waiting.
But I got you, this is a,
You want me to show you Harvest of Shame?
no, please. I previewed it with the master. But Michael, you're only getting better, and by association, as a friend of about 35 years, me too. But just and I do have a question, but a comment on your question. Michael gave it's a typical brilliant answer. Simply, first, the legislature of New Jersey would ask that question or assert the issue that, well, in this time, why should we be embarrassed? Because it's just a complete red herring. It doesn't cost Rutgers or any public institution a dime. I mean, the state a dime. So, and given the disinvestment in public higher education and the jettison of public colleges and universities around the nation, that's a whole other topic. Michael, it's just not. Answer it direct. I would deal with a elected official or a public policymaker directly and just challenge, just deconstruct the argument because it is not. But Michael, the question now, then one little comment with it is if you think you'd like to comment more on the distinction between domicile, residency, and citizenship. Those issues got somewhat confused here when
they asked your children.
Yeah, a comment from the other side about the Republicans. Well, the Democrats, the in-state tuition issue in New Jersey didn't fail because of the Republicans. John Corzine, who postured on lots of stuff, he postured so much that's why he's not governor right now, because he was very ineffective and one of the worst advocates I've ever seen dealing with 8 governors. You can tell him my
Speaking of having to encourage your convictions on your way out of the office.
No, I've been saying that.
Now I know why we've got cuts
Yeah, and with a relatively well-organized lobby over a period of time to move that legislation, it was the Democrats, not the Republicans, who failed to move it. And so part of it was a lack of conviction and some purposeful confusion of some of the things that Dr. Olivas is pointing out. But people, I think, largely understood the differences in the issue of citizenship and undocumented residents are different issues, and that was, Michael said, one is a federal and a national issue, and in terms of in-state residency, which is determined by law, there's 2 different issues. But they got purposely conveniently confused, and without all of the hate rhetoric that, again, Michael refers to. Right. So, Mike, can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, it was a tremendous disappointment because I worked behind the scenes with the staff member who put this together, who to protect the guilty, I'm going to not mention names, who's a law professor on leave, who was a public advocate. Other than that, and I thought it was a good faith, and I know that there are people in this room who were involved in this effort, and I thought it was a done deal. At the last minute, the political courage was lacking, but it wasn't because the report was unclear on this. Someone today at lunch asked me, well, what about students? Because a bill was actually introduced to give residence status to children of diplomats. You know, the pobrecitos, the ones who can't afford it because they got no money because they aren't at the top of the heap. I really feel sorry for them. The Lord said, "Joy shall have the poor among you." I also believe you also shall have the rich among you. And sometimes they block and tackle for the others. If those two had come up together, I would have not spoken against it. But in as much as it didn't, it's absurd. First of all, these children, A2s or A3, the children, and by the way, servants and domestics of ambassadors, A holders, aren't allowed to have domicile here. They aren't subject to the jurisdiction. If they are born, they're the one of 2 exceptions. If you're born in the United States while a diplomatic child, you don't get citizenship because you're not subject to the jurisdiction. That means that you are removed. You're in like a bubble that doesn't confer citizenship upon you. The other exception, by the way, is you can't be born on a warship during a time of war. Frankly, I just don't. I'd love to have that client, so I could challenge that exception. I think they take most pregnant women off warships before they deliver, so they won't have anchor baby. Literally, that's anchor baby. You throw the baby over and it anchors you. Maybe that's the term. But when I saw that bill, when Mike sent me that bill, I just howled. I posted it on sort of the can you believe this.com, in effect. And believe me, there's a lot of stuff that goes on there, mostly Arizona-based. But they do not pay taxes. They come here on A visas. Anybody who comes here on an F basis as a student is required to maintain a foreign domicile, so they can't come here and do that. They aren't similarly situated. They didn't go to the high schools for 3 years the way that these other, the undocumented are required to do so in most of the states. By the way, a number that everybody wants, a recent reporter asked me just 2 weeks ago, how did all these legislators come up with 3 years and have this affidavit requirement? And I said, well, I wrote the very first statute. I've written 6 of them, 6. And someone was saying, well, we don't want them to come over here and start going to college. So I said, well, they said, how about 4 years? I said, well, high school in Texas is 3 years. So that's how that number came about. I mean, through thorough analytic research and scholarship, I simply plucked it out. The other was someone said, well, I want to make sure that when they're eligible, they'll apply for citizenship. And I said, boy, that is the most unnecessary statute I could think of. The minute one of them gets it, believe me, word will spread. It's like that there's pizza left in the lunchroom, and it gets out to students. Within 5 minutes, it's completely gone. Well, it's the same thing here. That affidavit requirement is also one I had, and they both came in to fend up, to buy in a couple of Western Texas legislators. And that's how they ended up in the other states. So all those roads led to me and my thorough research on this issue. 3 years was better than 4. I figured it was not bad, and so that's how that happened. So the answer is that is a group that's not deserving of support because they're not disadvantaged, and because it would give them a windfall beyond belief. They aren't required, by the way, to pay taxes here. There's an exchange agreement by treaty that we have with ambassadors and so forth. And yet, if I'm sympathetic, if they had a residence requirement that would fold in both groups, I'd support it in a minute. There are a lot of, in California, the statute there, as I said earlier, only 20% of the people are undocumented. The California statute that was recently litigated and upheld, all these others are using it because they spent high school over there for 3 years, left, and then come back and use it. I'm willing for that to happen if you can keep the 20. But the reason it got sued wasn't because these Beverly Hills kids that left and came back. It's because of the undocumented. That's why that statute was litigated. It wasn't the others, and if it got struck down, it would have been hurting more citizens than it would have been the undocumented. I'm willing to deal with that if that's the only way you can get it through. I advised them against it. I told them this would happen. Now, I'm not an I told you so kind of person, but if I were, now would be the time when I was acting like that. That would make me so unlovable, though. Any other questions people might have? Yes, you get the last question.
Okay. I guess it seems like you have the kind of bird's eye view and the unique perspective on how federalism works in cases in this area of law. And so you've mentioned to us that New Jersey and Florida are standouts in a bad sense, right? Being among the states with the highest concentration of immigrants that don't have an in-state tuition law. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a little insight about why it is that kind of hodgepodge collection, Nebraska, Utah,
that's such a good question.
Oklahoma. Why? Why
well,
they're
and I
places?
in my book, available in fine bookstores everywhere, soon to be major motion picture, starring Jimmy Smith as me, because of the eerie resemblance. Every state, remember the old TV story, there were a million stories in the naked city, New York being the naked city. Well, there are a million stories in the naked city state. Kansas did it because there was a person who wanted to run with it. Utah got it, I think, because LDS thinks that Mexicans are God's people. And I truly believe that's why I did it. And that's, I'd rather have that than the Long Island view of that. Going beaner hunting. New York got it and had this really badly drafted statute. The guy later was indicted and removed for office, Espada. The one that just recently gave rise to this New Jersey student who went to high school there, who's never lived in New York, but gets the residency because of the way they drafted this. Every state's got something like that. In Texas, I started testifying on that 16 years before it was actually enacted. Finally found somebody to carry the water. couldn't sell Democrats on it. Finally found a Republican governor who signed it because he thought it might bring Latino Republicans in and give them something, and he was good on this issue. So I look for help wherever I find it, and I find it in odd places. Normally, if Senator Hatch would introduce something, I would get it out. I'd look real carefully at the details, because I can't believe something he would invoke is something I would support. But of course I do. And Democrats took walks on this last one, and they introduced it at the last minute, was bound to fail, and so pox on both their houses. Every state has one like that. It started in Oklahoma because I spoke about this at a state higher education, an ACWA state kind of thing, National Association of College University Attorneys. And this guy calls me up a week later and said, we'd like you to come up here and help us in Oklahoma. And so I drafted it and took it up there, and they said, I know it's enacted. Of course, 2 years later, they found out who wrote it, and so they rescinded it, but it's still grandfathered in all those people, so some folks got, and of course, Kansas, when it was sued in federal court, they found out 14 undocumented persons had gotten it, a whole 14 occasioned a federal case, so much for tort reform, and so forth. So every state has a different history. Some of these have been written about. No one has, if anybody here is looking for a dissertation topic, write about, well, I know anybody looking for dissertation, he's got his topic, and at some point, he's going to be, the statute of limitations is going to run. How's that for a shout out? Yeah. It's a great topic. No one's ever written about it. I can't find a word about how that happened. Maybe one of Espada's assistants or go up and visit him in prison or something like that to find out what happened. Every state needs to have these kinds of legislative histories, and they haven't been written about very much. So every one of them has a different history, a different reason. There's almost always a given advocate. And like any other policy diffusion or policy dispersal kind of literature, if it these groups meet. So I met this guy at NACWA. If you go to the National Conference of State Legislatures, the people talk, and the same thing happens it happened with 529 plans. One state decided to do one, and all of a sudden, other states thought it was a good idea. It looked like a good idea at the time. Now, in retrospect, they look like really poopy head ideas, that's from the poopy head literature that my niece has. So it was just like one of those, and Texas was the first one, and it was before 9/11. All the other ones, commendably, were after 9/11, when he had some undocumented students who were involved in the terrorism, and that set it back, set back comprehensive immigration reform as well. But states always want to look out for their own interests, and so this, if you catch them at the right time with the right proposal, with something that seems like it's going to incorporate, this has many features of immigrant integration, which everybody wants. I mean, no one wants the undocumented. I understand in the abstract, but we want them because we've never done anything to stop them, and we do all these things to invite them, including, policies for years. And Texas has a bill that's about to pass the House that's going to make it illegal in Texas to hire someone who's unauthorized. But they have 3 exceptions: domestic work, lawn work, and day labor. Well, that means that the undocumented engineers are really running from this legislation. You know what? Under hypocrisy, there's Texas leg. Good thing is they only meet every other year for special sessions, so the damage they can do is relatively limited. But they can do a lot. They're like busy little beavers. We don't really want to. If we've ever really wanted to, we wouldn't build a fence and then sell 21-foot ladders on the other side. We would be more serious about developing the border and having a more orderly form. Right now, if I were a permanent resident here legally, and I were married to a woman from Mexico, it would take me 8 years to bring her here legally because of the per country restrictions on this. If I were from the Philippines and wanted to bring a brother here, it would be 17 years right now. The reason that people come here in an authorized fashion is because it is so hard and impossible, absent lutefisk or being Nordic, to come here easily. So you got these backlogs that take years and years to come here. So people naturally are going to jump the queue. It's the same way that you do on Saturday nights when you want to get in to see the movie. You know, if there's a little bit of movement, that's the way this is. And so we don't want to reform that. We don't want to reform the unauthorized part. What we want to do is accuse them of being criminals and pile on the criminality, and then it costs us to incarcerate them and provide them with Miranda rights and all the other, due processes, which isn't all that much. And then we wonder how much, and then we say, well, first, before we do comprehensive immigration reform, we have to secure the borders. Well, what's it going to take? How could we secure it anymore? We've never had so many deportations, so little deferred action. We've never had so many people being deported. We've never had so many people in incarceration for this. I don't know what the metrics are, and I'm not sure, by the way, that anybody can tell me what the metrics are, because they're never going to be achieved. This is like the classic catch-22. You catch 22 million of these folks. I'm going to say, well, there's 40 out there. You've taken so long. There are 40 out there. So it's not being argued on the metrics or on the law or even on the equity. This is kind of general and differentiated. We don't like them. We like them as long as they come here and clean our houses. The Texas hypocrisy is perfect. I couldn't have made this up, by the way. Honestly, people, when I said this the other day to a civic group, they said, I haven't heard about that. I said, well, did you read page C19 of the Houston Chronicle, the report, buried back with the corset ads back there? Well, yeah, when an undocumented person, jumps bail or something, it's on the front page, and they send out Amber alerts, etc. Well, you've all been very generous. I appreciate the time. Thank you all so much.